Howdy y'all, my name is Caitlin and I'm going to be showing you beginner tips and tricks to help you learn how to sew. This video is definitely for people that have either never sewn before, they're really new to sewing and want to learn the basics, or you've sewn for a while and you just want a refresher course. I am a small business owner and I make upcycles, which are things made out of secondhand materials, whether that be from the thrift store, donation, garage sale, or even old things from my own closet. A little bit of a caveat, I have been a seamstress for less than a year. I am half self-taught and half mom-taught, and everything in this video is going to be something that I have implemented into my small business for making upcycles. If you're looking for a certain tutorial or concept, example, something I don't cover in this video, make sure to comment below and I'll make a separate video answering all your guys' questions. So with all that said, let's get started. To start, I'm just going to go over some basic terminology. So a stitch is a loop of thread resulting from a single pass or movement of the needle in sewing. The two methods I use to combine fabric is sewing and serging. Serge means an overlock stitch, which is a type of stitch that prevents fabric from fraying and is used for hemming, edging, and seaming. Sewing usually means a lock or a chain stitch, and this is a lock stitch, which is a type of stitch that uses double thread. A seam is a line along two pieces of fabric that are sewn together in a garment or other article. This is usually what you're going to use the serger for because it gives you that nice clean edge. Pins and clips are two different ways to hold fabric together when sewing. I prefer clips because they're stronger and I'm less likely to sew over one, but both of them work great. A hem is the edge of a piece of fabric that keeps it secure. This shirt was made using a specialty machine, but I'll usually just serge and then sew it down. A backstitch is a way of securing a seam with a sewing machine. It provides extra security and prevents the edges of your stitch from coming undone. I'm going to go over how to do this in depth later in the video. A presser foot is a small attachment for a sewing machine that holds fabric flat and smooth while it's being stitched. Whenever I'm trying to sew in a straight line, I like to use the edge of the presser foot as a guide. A bobbin is a cylinder or spindle that holds thread, yarn, wire, tape, or film. Now that you guys know all the basic terminology, I'm going to teach you how to sew things together, starting with pinning and clipping. So if you did miss any of those terms, you don't quite understand, I quite literally just Googled all of them. So if you're confused about something, definitely just a quick Google search can help you with that. Also, if you can't tell, it is the next day. Have a little outfit change. So yeah, let's get to it. Like I said before, I prefer to use clips, but I will teach you how to use both. To start, get two pieces of fabric you want to sew together and then grab one of your clips. You want to start with both of your pieces facing right side out. Then you're going to take one of your pieces and flip it over the other so that the outsides are now facing in and the insides are facing out. Now you need to start lining up your fabric on one side, and that is where the seam is going to be. The reason you flip the fabric to where the insides are facing out is so that the seam is on the inside and you have a nice clean edge on the outside. Once you have your fabric oriented correctly, you're going to want to make sure it lines up perfectly straight along the edge. Once you do this, you can start clipping. I'm going to clip right here on the edge and then work my way down along the edge of the pieces. This is what the finished product should look like. As you can see, the pieces line up nice on the edge, and you can see that nice clean finish that will be on the outside. I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with pins. Once again, you're going to flip a piece so that the insides are facing out and the outsides are facing in. For the first pin, you want to start along the edge. To start, you're going to push the pin through both pieces of fabric, and as you can see, it has gone through both sides. Then you're going to angle the pin downward. After you do this, you're going to angle it back up towards the top and push it through both pieces of fabric. After you get your first pin, you're going to get the next one and work your way down the edge. Once again, you're going to push the pin through both pieces of fabric, angle it down, and push it back up towards the top. How far you space the pins apart is entirely up to you, it just depends on what you're comfortable with. When I'm sewing just a straight line, I actually don't use a lot of clips or pins, I just kind of orient the fabric as I sew. Here is the finished pinned project. As you can see, it lines up pretty straight, and now you're ready for the sewing machine. At the beginning and ending of everything I sew, I backstitch. I did not backstitch these two pieces, and as you can see, it easily falls apart. To start backstitching, you're going to lower the presser foot and go about 3 or 4 stitches into your piece. The backstitch button is different on every machine, but mine is right here. You want to backstitch all the way back to the edge of your pieces. When you get there, you're going to press the backstitch button again and start sewing forward. That piece of fabric I'm cutting off is something I always sew onto after I finish a project. It prevents the threads from falling out of the machine or getting tangled. Now that I've backstitched, I'm going to sew all the way down the edge of the pieces. I always remove the pins right before they get to the presser foot so I don't sew over them. To sew a straight line, you want to line up the edge of your fabric with one of the ruler markings on the side, or you can use the presser foot, which is what I'm doing here. As you're sewing, you want to continue guiding the fabric along that line. You want to sew all the way to the end of your pieces and backstitch again. So I'm going to press the backstitch button, backstitch about 3 or 4 times, and then go forward again. If your fabric bunches up while you're backstitching, it's okay, just try to straighten it out a little bit, and usually when you sew forward again, it'll even out. Also, if your backstitching is a little wonky, that's okay. I've been sewing for close to a year and I still can't get it perfect every time. Thankfully, even when you do sew it a little bit wonky, it's not going to show up on the front. Since I finished sewing these pieces, I'm going to sew onto my scrap piece and finish the project. As you can see, when I try to pull these apart, it doesn't work. This is why I always backstitch at the beginning and end. I want all the things I make to be durable and not fall apart. Here you can see the nice clean edge, and now you're ready to reinforce it. There are 6 different combinations I use to reinforce a seam. If you do not have a serger or are not comfortable using one, the first 2 options are for you. For the first method, you're going to sew exactly how you did the first time, but this time you're going to do it a little bit closer to the edge. You can see that instead of lining up my fabric with the edge of the presser foot, I'm actually doing it a little bit inside. You want to sew closer to the edge because if you do it on the other side, you're actually going to end up using more of your fabric. Whenever you sew, your project will always shrink a little bit. My average seam is anywhere from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. Let's say I did 1/2 inch for this one, that means that I used up a total of 1 inch of fabric. If I reinforced the seam on the other side, further from the edge, I would end up using 1.5 inches or more. This is why when you cut pieces, you always want to make them a little bit bigger than you think. I've sewn all the way down to the edge. I'm going to backstitch to reinforce it, and then sew forward again. I'm going to sew onto my scrap piece of fabric again, cut it off, and then I'm done. I recommend option 1 for people that don't have sergers or if you've never sewn before. If you happen to mess up, it's much easier to rip out sewn seams compared to serge seams. As you can see, after reinforcing it, we still have our nice clean edge. Option 2 is pretty similar, but you're actually going to be sewing on top of your fabric. This method is called top stitching, and as it sounds, you are literally stitching on top. Unlike the other method, you definitely need to make sure you sew in a straight line for this one because it will be seen on the outside. However, the process is still the same. You're going to sew a couple of stitches, backstitch all the way to the edge, and then go all the way down. I still use this method for a lot of my projects because I think it gives them a unique design. Here is the finished top stitch. As you can see, it looks really nice and is pretty even. I had reused the pieces from the other method, but you don't have to sew 3 times. Just sew your initial seam and then you can top stitch and it's perfectly reinforced. Methods 3 through 6 require a serger. You will need to know how to turn the serger cutter on and off. Usually there's a switch on the side of the machine like this. For option number 3, you're going to have to sew 2 pieces together and turn the serger cutter off. You want to line up the stitches you made with the little tiny dot on the presser foot. When you put the fabric in, make sure you put it in far enough because if you don't, it's going to get jammed like so and then get all wonky. You want to make sure you slide your fabric as far in as it will go, lower the presser foot, and then start to serge. You need to make sure that you're keeping your stitches in line with the dot on the presser foot. Then you cut off the extra serge pieces, and here you have a reinforced seam. For this next method, you're going to want to turn the cutter on. I recommend this method once you start getting comfortable with the serger machine. Once again, keep your stitches in line with the dot on the presser foot, and it's going to cut off the extra fabric that you don't need along the edge. If you serge with the stitches to the right of the dot, it's actually going to cut off the part you sewn. As you can see, I lined it up perfectly because the serged part is right next to the sewn seam without going over. The bottom piece is the one with the cutter on, and as you can see, it's slightly more straight than the top. However, both methods still work great. This next method has 2 pieces that have not been sewn together. If this is your first time trying this method, I recommend using pins or clips. With this method, you have no sewn seam to guide you. Instead, you're going to line up the edge of your fabric with the cutter on the machine. Even though the cutter isn't on, it's still a good visual guide for when you're not using it. Just like the others, you're going to serge all the way down and then cut off the extra pieces. As you can see, even without sewing, you can get a nice clean seam. For this next method, I'm using 2 pieces that also haven't been sewn together. As you can see, the edges actually aren't that straight, so this is the perfect time to use this method with the cutter on. Just like option 5, you're going to line up the pieces with the edge of the cutter, and this time it's just going to cut off those extra pieces and give you a nice even seam. Whenever you're reinforcing a seam, you can use the serger by itself, but if you sew, you do need to reinforce it some other way, whether that be serging or sewing again. I'm going to cut off the extra pieces, and then you can see I have a nice, clean, serged seam. Here are the no-sew serge methods. The bottom one is the one with the cutter on, and as you can see, it is slightly more even than the other. Here are all the methods side by side. As you can see, they all give you a nice clean seam, so whichever one you choose is really up to you. Ripping is the worst part of sewing in my opinion. I use this tool to help me rip out stitches. I've seen tons of methods on the internet on how to rip out seams efficiently, but none of them have really worked for me. I just have to rip them out one by one. To rip it out, I hook the point under each individual stitch and then pull up and it will rip. Whenever you're ripping, make sure you're only getting the point under thread and not into the fabric because it will rip a hole in your fabric. Whenever I mess up, I always try to rip the seams and start again so that I'm not wasteful. There's a couple of things I recommend investing in as a beginner sewist, the first being a sewing machine, obviously. We use a FAF, but we also have a Baby Lock, which is a much cheaper sewing machine. You really don't need anything super fancy when you're starting out. They both do the same thing. They work great. This one just has a couple extra things like fancy stitches and things like that. Definitely get a sewing machine if you'd like to learn how to sew. The second thing would be scissors and a rotary cutter. We have nice fabric scissors called Ginger. They're a lot more heavy duty than just normal scissors, and you'll probably want to get a pair of those if you're going to sew. And then also a rotary cutter, which just looks like a pizza cutter in my opinion, and this works well whenever you're trying to cut in a straight line. Next, you're going to need pins or clips. I don't think you'll need both. You can just get what you prefer. They're both very cheap, so you can try them both out. I personally prefer clips. I just think they're a little bit stronger, and they're easier to see. I'm not going to accidentally sew over one of them. Next, you're going to want to get a table, which you don't have to buy a specific table, just any table in your house is fine, and get a nice cutting mat. There's a bug. You don't absolutely need a cutting mat, but it will make things much more difficult for you if you don't have one. If you don't want to get one, I would suggest just getting a ruler or some sort of tape measure. I don't know if you can hear that. There's a bug somewhere. I've never been stung by a bee or a wasp. I really hope today is not the day. The last thing I would consider investing in is quality thread. So that really just depends on the type of sewing machine you have. We have a FAF. I'm not entirely sure on the brand we use. I just know it's a nicer brand because some of the cheaper quality threads, they don't want to go through the machine smoothly. I would suggest looking up what type of thread your sewing machine works with best and getting some of that. All this to say, at the end of the day, you really only need a sewing machine. There's other little things that can make it a lot easier, but you don't need to go out and invest $1 million to start sewing. All you need to do is really get a sewing machine. You could even hand sew if you wanted. Now that would make it a lot more difficult, but you don't have to have the best and the newest thing to be a sewist. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment anything that you thought I did well, what I need to improve on, something you'd like to hear about. I would love to hear your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.